Dave Mustaine has never been shy about sharing his opinions, and recently he made waves once again, calling out the nu metal genre and celebrating its decline.
In 1988, during a high-profile recording session in Los Angeles, Dave Mustaine reportedly threw a producer's platinum record across the room, shattering it against a wall. What happened next would spark years of industry tension, create unlikely alliances among competing bands, and make some musicians declare they'd rather retire than share another tour bus with the Megadeth frontman.
And it was okay going from nothing to everything to nothing, but then having someone stand on the back of my head and keep me underwater.
From studio confrontations to backstage ultimatums, this is the story of the complicated relationships between Dave Mustaine and his fellow metal legends. Dave Mustaine was born on September 13, 1961, in La Mesa, California. His full name was David Scott Mustaine, and his early years were marked by hardship. Growing up with an unstable family situation and an alcoholic father, young Dave found solace and escape in music. His childhood was far from ideal. He moved frequently, experienced periods of poverty, and witnessed domestic conflicts that would later influence his aggressive musical style and sometimes confrontational personality. By age 17, Mustaine was immersed in the local Southern California music scene, teaching himself guitar techniques that would later become hallmarks of thrash metal. Even as a teenager, his exceptional talent was evident. His fingers moved across the fretboard with blistering speed and precision that made other young guitarists watch in awe. Local musicians recall a young man possessed by music, often practicing for hours until his fingers bled, pushing himself to master increasingly complex techniques. Even back then, Dave had this intensity, recalled one early bandmate who played with him in a pre-Metallica outfit. He wasn't just playing guitar, he was battling it, conquering it. And he expected everyone around him to have that same fire. When you didn't meet his standards, he'd let you know immediately and not gently. Music became Mustaine's obsession and salvation. He studied the techniques of hard rock pioneers like Jimmy Page and Ritchie Blackmore, while developing a distinctive playing style characterized by aggressive alternate picking and complex, technical riffs. This virtuosity quickly caught the attention of the burgeoning metal scene in California, where a new, faster, more aggressive form of heavy music was taking shape. In 1981, Mustaine's trajectory changed dramatically when he joined a fledgling band called Metallica. Lars Ulrich and James Hetfield had placed an advertisement seeking a lead guitarist. According to band lore, Mustaine arrived at the audition without an amplifier, plugged into Hetfield's amp, and unleashed a series of solos that left the room silent with amazement. He was immediately invited to join the band. During his time with Metallica, Mustaine co-wrote several songs that would become cornerstones of thrash metal, including The Four Horsemen, originally titled The Mechanics, Jump in the Fire, and parts of Metal Militia. His aggressive playing and intense personality helped define Metallica's early sound, pushing them toward what would eventually be recognized as thrash metal. A sound engineer who worked with the early Metallica lineup remembered, Dave brought this technical element to their sound. Hetfield and Ulrich had the energy and the vision, but Mustaine had this trained musician's approach, even though he was largely self-taught. He could execute ideas that were beyond what the others could play at that time. It created this interesting tension in the music itself. However, Mustaine's tenure with Metallica was tumultuous and brief. His battles with substance abuse, combined with a confrontational demeanor, created tension within the band. What started as creative differences quickly escalated into personal conflicts. Bandmates reported Mustaine becoming increasingly unpredictable, prone to mood swings and aggressive behavior when drinking. The breaking point came in April 1983 when Metallica was in New York preparing to record their debut album, Kill 'Em All. After a series of incidents, including alleged physical altercations and destructive behavior, Mustaine was abruptly fired. The dismissal became infamous in metal history. He was woken up, handed a bus ticket back to California, and told his services were no longer required. They didn't even let me pack up my stuff properly, Mustaine would later recall in interviews. One minute I'm in Metallica, the next I'm on a bus heading cross-country with nothing but anger and a head full of riffs. This dismissal left Mustaine with a burning determination to prove himself. The bus ride from New York to California became legendary in metal circles. It was during this journey that he reportedly began formulating plans for a new band that would play music even faster and more technical than Metallica. His goal wasn't just to succeed, it was to overshadow his former bandmates. By late 1983, Mustaine had formed Megadeth with bassist David Ellefson, launching what would become one of the most influential careers in metal history. The band's name itself, derived from Megadeath, a term for 1 million deaths by nuclear explosion, reflected Mustaine's dark mindset and apocalyptic vision. From the beginning, Megadeth was positioned not just as another thrash band, but as a direct competitor to Metallica. Mustaine recruited musicians with exceptional technical ability, focusing on creating music that was more complex and challenging than what his former band was producing. Early Megadeth rehearsals were notorious for their intensity, with Mustaine demanding perfection and berating those who couldn't keep up. Working with Dave in those early days was like being in musical boot camp, said a guitarist who briefly played with early Megadeth. He'd make you play the same passage for hours. If you missed a note, you'd start over. It was exhausting, but you became a better player, if you survived the experience. As Megadeth's profile rose throughout the mid-1980s with albums like Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good, and Peace Sells, But Who's Buying, so did stories of Mustaine's volatile behavior. Metal journalists from publications like Kerrang and Metal Hammer documented numerous incidents, from heated arguments with sound engineers to walkouts during interviews when questions veered toward his Metallica past. One industry insider who worked closely with several thrash bands during this era recalled, "Dave was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But there was always this unpredictability. You'd have a great conversation about music theory one minute, and the next, he'd be furious about something most people wouldn't even notice. It made collaboration really difficult, even when everyone recognized his talent." Studio sessions with Megadeth gained a reputation for high tension and perfectionism, bordering on obsession. Recording engineers spoke of Mustaine demanding dozens of takes for guitar solos that already sounded flawless to everyone else in the room. When working with producers, he would often challenge their suggestions, leading to creative standoffs that sometimes lasted days. He had this laser focus on how he wanted things to sound, said one producer who worked on a Megadeth album in the late 1980s. And he wouldn't compromise, even when the label was pressuring us about deadlines and budgets. In one session, we spent 3 days on a guitar part that lasts maybe 15 seconds in the final mix. That's both his genius and what made him difficult. That relentless pursuit of his exact vision. By 1986, the thrash metal scene had fully exploded, with bands like Metallica, Slayer, Anthrax, and Megadeth leading the charge. While public rivalries, particularly between Mustaine and Metallica, made headlines, there was also a sense of community among these pioneering groups. They were collectively creating something new and revolutionary in heavy music. This sense of community occasionally extended to collaborative projects. Various combinations of thrash bands would share stages, influence each other's music, and even participate in joint interviews. However, when Mustaine was involved, these collaborations often became complicated. A former A&R executive for a major label recalled an incident from 1987. "We had this idea to get several thrash guitarists together for a special feature in a guitar magazine, kind of a roundtable discussion plus a jam session. Everyone was on board initially, but when one guitarist heard Mustaine would be there, he pulled out immediately. Said something like, 'I'm not spending 6 hours being told I'm playing everything wrong.' Others started dropping too. The whole thing fell apart." This pattern of tense relationships extended beyond just the Metallica connection. Throughout the late 1980s, stories circulated about challenging interactions between Mustaine and members of other prominent metal bands, including Slayer, Anthrax, and Exodus. Kerry King of Slayer, known for his own outspoken nature, reportedly had several heated exchanges with Mustaine at festivals where both bands performed. At one European festival in 1988, witnesses described a backstage confrontation that nearly became physical when King made an offhand comment about Megadeth's recent lineup changes. "It was like watching two alpha wolves," recalled a roadie who was present. Neither would back down, both surrounded by their people. Eventually, they were separated, but you could feel the tension for the rest of the event. Crews from both bands were told to stay away from each other. According to those familiar with both musicians, the conflict stemmed partly from their similar roles as lead guitarists known for their technical skill and strong opinions. There was a competitive aspect to their relationship, with each seemingly determined to prove their band's superiority in the thrash metal hierarchy. Kerry and Dave were both guitar players with very strong ideas about how thrash should sound, explained a sound engineer who worked with both bands. They approached it differently, Kerry with this raw, aggressive style, and Dave with more classical influences and technical complexity. Both thought their approach was the right one for the genre. Put them in a room together, and it was just a matter of time before sparks flew. Scott Ian of Anthrax had a more diplomatic, but still strained relationship with Mustaine. In various interviews throughout the years, Ian acknowledged Mustaine's musical genius while expressing frustration at the difficulty of maintaining a personal relationship. Dave's contribution to metal is undeniable, Ian once told a metal magazine in the early 1990s. But there's always been this intensity to dealing with him. Some days everything's great, and you're talking about music and having a blast. Other days, it's like walking on eggshells. The relationship between Ian and Mustaine was complicated by Anthrax's friendship with Metallica. As part of the thrash scene, Anthrax frequently toured and collaborated with Metallica, putting Ian in the awkward position of maintaining connections with both sides of a very public feud. Scott was always caught in the middle, said a mutual friend of both musicians. He respected Dave's talent enormously, but was also close with the Metallica guys. There were times when he had to play peacemaker, and that's a thankless role when dealing with personalities that strong. The most notorious incident occurred during the planning stages for what could have been a historic thrash metal tour in 1989. Representatives from several major thrash bands had gathered in New York to discuss a potential package tour that would showcase the best of the genre. According to multiple sources who were present, the meeting started productively. Ideas were flowing, potential venues were discussed, and there was genuine excitement about bringing multiple thrash bands together for fans. Then the topic of billing came up. Specifically, which band would headline on which nights. Mustaine, representing Megadeth, reportedly insisted on co-headlining status with Metallica, despite Metallica's significantly larger commercial success at the time. When this was questioned, Mustaine allegedly launched into a lengthy critique of the other band's technical abilities and commercial compromises. "It got heated fast," said a tour manager who was in the room. Dave started breaking down why Megadeth deserved top billing, song complexity, technical skill, all that. Then he started pointing out specific songs from other bands that he thought were derivative or simplistic. By the end, half the room was ready to walk out. The proposed tour eventually happened in a modified form, with some bands participating and others declining. Those who opted out frequently cited scheduling conflicts, though industry insiders understood the real reasons were more complicated. Despite these conflicts, Mustaine's technical brilliance and songwriting prowess earned him respect even from those who found him difficult. Gary Holt of Exodus, while acknowledging the challenges of working with Mustaine, also praised his perfectionism. "Look, I've had my run-ins with Dave like everybody else, Holt told an interviewer in the mid-1990s, but I've never questioned his commitment to the music. The guy would spend hours getting a single guitar power part exactly right. That level of dedication, you have to respect it, even if you don't always enjoy being around it. Chuck Billy of Testament offered a similar perspective. Dave pushed everyone to be better, sometimes in ways that weren't comfortable. He'd hear something in your playing or your band's sound and just call it out, no filter. It could come across harsh, but often he was right. That's the complex thing. Even when he was being difficult, he was pushing metal forward. This duality, the musical genius paired with interpersonal challenges, created a complicated relationship between Mustaine and the broader metal community. Many musicians found themselves simultaneously admiring his talent while dreading interactions with him. A particularly illustrative incident occurred at a music equipment convention in the late 1980s. Several prominent metal guitarists had gathered for a promotional event featuring the latest amplifiers and effects pedals. Mustaine arrived late and immediately began testing equipment at volumes that drowned out everyone else. He wasn't being deliberately rude, recalled an industry representative who was present. In his mind, he was just focused on getting the right sound, but he seemed oblivious to how it affected everyone around him. When another guitarist, a pretty well-known one, asked if he could turn down a bit, Dave launched into this technical explanation of why he needed that specific volume to achieve the harmonics he wanted. It wasn't confrontational, exactly, but it made clear that his needs came first. Throughout the 1990s, as thrash metal faced commercial challenges from the rise of grunge and alternative rock, many of the genre's pioneers found themselves at a crossroads. Some bands changed their sound, others doubled down on their thrash roots, and lineup changes became common. During this transitional period, Mustaine's relationship with his peers remained complicated. Former Megadeth guitarist Marty Friedman, who played with the band during its commercial peak in the early 1990s, later described the experience as musically fulfilling but personally exhausting. Dave's standards were impossibly high, Friedman told a Japanese guitar magazine years after leaving Megadeth. That pushed us to create some amazing music, but it also meant constant tension. Nothing was ever good enough, including his own playing sometimes. He'd redo parts dozens of times, looking for perfection. This perfectionism extended to Mustaine's expectations of other bands, particularly when sharing festival bills or tour packages. Sound engineers and stage managers from the era tell stories of Mustaine critically evaluating other bands' performances, sometimes offering unsolicited advice on how they could improve.
I'll explain in as simple terms as I can, not to stultify you, but to just make it really easy.
There was this one festival in Germany, recalled a tour manager who worked with several thrash bands. Dave watched this younger band's set from the side of the stage. Afterward, he walked right up to their guitarist and spent 10 minutes breaking down everything he thought was wrong with their tone and technique. The guy looked shell-shocked. Some people might have appreciated the input from a legend, but it's all in the delivery, you know? One of the most revealing windows into Mustaine's complex relationships came during the planning of the Clash of the Titans tour in 1990 and 1991, which featured Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax, with Alice in Chains as an opener in North America. While the tour was successful, behind-the-scenes tensions were constant. We basically had separate everything, recalled a tour manager. Separate dressing room areas, separate times for sound check, separate areas backstage. It was like running 3 different tours that happened to share a stage. The bands barely interacted except when they absolutely had to for press or meet and greets. This separation wasn't solely due to Mustaine. Each band had its own established routines and preferences. However, several crew members noted that the barriers seemed higher and more strictly enforced when Megadeth was involved. With Slayer and Anthrax, there was some crossover, explained a guitar technician who worked the tour. Their crews would hang out, share beers after shows. The bands themselves would occasionally watch each other's sets. But Megadeth was like its own island. Dave had specific requirements about privacy and space. He was focused on delivering a perfect show every night, and anything that might disrupt that preparation was kept at a distance. Despite these separations, the tour demonstrated that professional collaboration was possible, even when personal relationships were strained. On stage, each band delivered powerful performances night after night, giving fans unforgettable shows despite the backstage tensions. "That's the thing people don't always understand about music at this level," said a promoter who worked on several dates of the tour. "You don't have to be friends to make great music together. Sometimes that tension, that competitive edge, actually pushes everyone to perform better." Each band wanted to outdo the others every night. The fans were the real winners. Throughout the 1990s, as Megadeth achieved significant commercial success with albums like Countdown to Extinction and Euthanasia, Mustaine's public image began to soften somewhat. Interviews from this period show a more reflective figure, occasionally acknowledging past conflicts while still maintaining his unwavering confidence in his musical vision. "I think success gave Dave some validation," observed a music journalist who interviewed him multiple times throughout the decade. He'd proven himself on his own terms. Megadeth had platinum records, Grammy nominations. He could point to concrete achievements that stood apart from the Metallica comparisons. That seemed to take some of the edge off, though he was still intensely focused and demanding. Even as his professional demeanor evolved, Mustaine's perfectionism remained legendary. Recording sessions for Megadeth albums continued to be described as grueling marathons of precision and repetition. Band members came and went, with many citing the pressure and intensity of working with Mustaine as factors in their departure. "It wasn't just that Dave was demanding," explained a former Megadeth rhythm guitarist. "It was that the goalposts were always moving. You'd nail a part exactly as discussed, then suddenly there'd be a new detail, a new nuance he wanted." For some musicians, that process is exhilarating. You're constantly improving. For others, it's maddening. There's no right or wrong reaction. It's just about whether your personality can mesh with that approach. A turning point in this complex web of relationships came in the early 2000s, when Mustaine suffered a serious injury to his arm that threatened to end his guitar-playing career. During his recovery period, he embraced sobriety and religion, experiences that he credited with giving him a new perspective on past conflicts. This personal transformation coincided with evolving attitudes throughout the metal community. As the pioneers of thrash entered their 40s and 50s, old rivalries began to seem less important than their collective legacy. The music they had created together, sometimes competitively, sometimes collaboratively, had changed the landscape of heavy music forever. The first significant thaw came with the Big Four concerts beginning in 2010, which brought together Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax for a series of shows celebrating thrash metal. These unprecedented events required all parties to set aside decades of tension for the sake of metal history. Behind the scenes, relations remained professional rather than warm. Footage from the events shows limited interaction between Mustaine and members of the other bands, particularly Metallica. Nonetheless, the fact that these shows happened at all represented a significant evolution from the fierce rivalries of earlier decades. The concerts themselves became landmark events in metal history. For many fans, seeing all four pioneering thrash bands on the same stage was something they never thought would happen. The final night of the European leg of the tour in Sofia, Bulgaria, was broadcast to movie theaters worldwide, cementing the historical significance of the moment. Whatever personal issues might have existed backstage, everybody recognized what these shows meant for metal, said a promoter involved with the Big Four concerts. It was about the legacy, about acknowledging that these four bands, despite their differences, had collectively created something important. Dave, James, Kerry, Scott. They all seemed to understand that this was bigger than any old grudges. In subsequent years, various metal musicians have offered reflections on their long-standing complicated relationships with Mustaine. Many acknowledge that while personal friendships might never develop, there's been a growing appreciation for each other's contributions to metal history. "We were all young, all had our issues," said one thrash pioneer who requested anonymity. "Dave's just happened to be more public. In the end, we all created something special for the fans. That's what matters now." Mustaine himself has acknowledged his past behavior in his 2010 autobiography.
"I cried when I turned the last page. I went, finally, no, true story. Finally, somebody has been able to put my life in print."
Mustaine, a heavy metal memoir, and in numerous interviews, attributing much of it to his struggles with addiction and the lingering resentment from his Metallica firing. "I burned a lot of bridges," Mustaine told a journalist in 2016. "Some have been rebuilt, others probably never will be. But I'm at peace with that now." The story of Mustaine's relationships with his fellow musicians represents more than just personal conflicts. It illuminates the intense pressures of the 1980s metal scene, where young musicians suddenly found themselves with fame, money, and influence they weren't always equipped to handle. For many thrash metal pioneers, maintaining a professional relationship with Mustaine reinforced the importance of separating the art from the artist. Despite personal frictions, they recognized his undeniable impact on the genre they all helped create. Mustaine's journey also reflects the possibility of evolution. From the bitter, vengeful guitarist determined to outdo his former bandmates, he gradually transformed into a more reflective figure, capable of acknowledging past mistakes while still taking pride in his musical legacy. In recent years, Mustaine has faced new challenges, including a battle with throat cancer in 2019 that forced him to temporarily step back from performing. The outpouring of support from across the metal community, including from musicians with whom he had historically tense relationships, demonstrated how perspectives change with time and adversity. "When Dave got sick, a lot of the old stuff just didn't matter anymore," said a tour manager who has worked with multiple thrash bands. "I saw guys who had sworn they'd never speak to him again, reaching out, offering support." Metal can be competitive, but it's also a brotherhood when it counts. Today, as these once young revolutionaries enter their 60s, the perspective of age has replaced much of the anger of youth. The canceled collaborations, the backstage arguments, and the years of minimal interaction have been absorbed into the broader narrative of thrash metal's turbulent history. A history none of them could have imagined when they first picked up their instruments as teenagers. In recent interviews, several metal musicians have offered more measured assessments of their complicated history with Mustaine. While few claim close friendship, there's a growing recognition of their shared place in music history. "We were all part of something bigger than ourselves," reflected one veteran thrash guitarist. "The music we created changed things forever. That connects us all, whether we've always gotten along or not. And Dave, whatever else you might say about him, was essential to that revolution. That's his legacy, and nobody can take it away." For Dave Mustaine, his fellow thrash pioneers, and the metal community that continues to analyze their complicated relationships, that connection, forged in the creative explosion of thrash metal and tested by human frailty, remains their most enduring collaboration, more powerful than any individual conflict or disagreement along the way.